This presentation is a makeup for the live session that didn't get recorded last week. Our 7401 section promised I would do a YouTube version of it, and this is the YouTube version. I'm also going to share it with the class that actually I went through the presentation, since it might be a helpful reference for you all when you start thinking about your projects. Basically, it's actually a very helpful designs. So let's get to it. Very briefly, evaluation designs, as you have been told at least 12 times before, is a way of structuring your intervention studies, basically your capstone projects, so that you can answer questions about the effectiveness of the work that you're doing 2 within 4 clients. It includes measurement procedures, as you can see, which we'll talk about in the future, and also includes, probably more germane to today, clear data collection points and procedures. It ensures comparisons can be made and helps to consider alternatives, alternative explanations, the so-called threats to internal validity that we need to be aware of. So a popular, actually it turns out to be very popular. I've been doing program evaluations for lots of years, and in many instances, the only thing we can actually do realistically is this group design called a one-group pre-post design, where literally, you can see here, literally, I don't know if you can see that. Let me see if I can turn on a pointer. I'll do a little a laser pointer. Hopefully you can see that. So you've got a pre-measurement. You got one group of people where you do a pre-measurement. Your participants then receive whatever program and intervention it is that you're going to do 2 within 4 then, and then they get measured on at a post-test, something after on knowledge, attitudes, values, behaviors, whatever the outcome dimension is, basically. Now what we do with that is do a paired samples t-test, which is the 2-headed arrow, and compute a standardized mean difference, which you by now know is very important to me and to college, basically. And we get, it's Cohenstein typically. So a problem with this design, unfortunately, is relatively weak, as you can see, for controlling for threats to internal validity. But it really, honestly, is often the only realistic design that we can actually do. I hope I don't have to do that every time. I don't know if you can actually see that or not, but I'll just do it. So one of the problems with this design, this one group pre-post design, is something's called response shift bias. So this is what happens, basically. If you give somebody a pre-test on whatever it is, your outcome that you're interested, or a set of questions about that measure your outcome, often people don't really have a good sense of what that's about. I often say in the literature, it's phrased as people don't know what they don't know. And depending on the population, other problems can happen with pre-tests. If you're working with kids or vulnerable populations, maybe people who are non-voluntary and voluntary participants, you get something called a social desirability bias, basically, where people are giving you answers to questions that they think you want to hear, rather than how they actually really feel about a particular question. So actually, there's all kinds of biases that come into measurements, probably for another total day, but clearly social desirability is a big deal, as is response shift. So if people don't actually know where they're starting, and give inaccurate, however it's inaccurate responses at a pretest, when you compare that to the post-test, you never quite ultimately know what you're comparing, basically. And this is called a response shift bias, as you can see. Incidentally, we posted a fair amount of material. I posted a fair amount of material in a module called Retrospective Post and Pre. So those of you who are interested in using this can actually read that material and run through it. It's actually pretty decent stuff, and I love this design actually. So for whatever that's worth. So anyway, out of this, basically response shift bias, some people came up with this retrospective post and pre, and literally, really, the only difference between the traditional pre-post and the post and pre-test is when the measure is taken. Essentially, what happens is that you only measure once at the post test in this design, and you actually have people rate where they think they started on questions. That may seem a little weird, but I'm going to give you an example of it in just a little bit. So you don't do the pre at the traditional pre-time. You actually wait until the post test and then include that sort of retrospective look at things. It's actually very cool. I have an example here. And actually, this is not far off from an example of a program evaluation I did at a maternal child health program at Columbus Public Health, basically called Caring for Two, which focused on new moms, basically, in prenatal care. Actually, new moms, prior to pregnancy and then shortly after the delivery as well. So it sort of covered that new mom range, basically. So let's say, for example, you're going to do an infant care skills training. I'm going to just do this as like a day training, but this will work if it doesn't have any kind of training that you're doing or any kind of group action intervention that you're doing. You could use this approach, basically. And one of the things that maybe I have down here that a lot of times when it comes to caring for babies, really, new moms really don't know what they don't know, and may give inaccurate responses to things like breastfeeding, things like detecting healthcare issues, things like safe sleep, the sorts of things that really go into really taking care of kids and new moms. I was once a new dad, and I actually didn't know what I didn't know, so this isn't going to be far off. If any of you are parents, you know exactly what I'm talking about. So this is an example of the instrument that we use. I sort of made this up, but this was not far off from what we use, but you don't really care about this. This would be the kind of thing that you would do essentially. And you can see the infant care activity that was covered through the day, basically quite a fair amount of information here. You can go down these topics. Sorry about that, clearing my throat business after. So sorry. So you can see how this gets rated. So you do this at the end of the day, and you rate. You would have people rate their confidence after participation in the day, and at that very same time, they would go over and rate where they started. Now this is the sort of important piece. It's argued that people are much more knowledgeable about where they started here because they've actually had some exposure to the content on these rating dimensions, that they actually know what it looks like to track normal growth and development, or to do balanced diet, or safety hazards, or safe sleep. So, if you started this at the beginning of the day, it's very likely that moms would be guessing in some ways at where they felt they were, and even more so, they might be more inclined to give socially desirable answers here, because it might not be. They might feel there's some risk to saying that they're not necessarily confident. I'm not sure that would be, in this case, a situation, but at least you have a sense of it. So a lot of our moms were worried about children's services, you know, coming in and being a part of their lives, interestingly enough. So this is not really the business of social desirability, actually, now to think about it, is not far off. So now I'm just going to show you the next page here. So it's kind of a continuation of you know, of the content, essentially. And then finally, we have an overall confidence in caring. Usually you want to put in, you don't have to, but it's not, depending on what you're measuring, what you're interested in, you might put in a summary measure like this, basically. So let's pretend we have 10 participants and they all responded in full to the questionnaire. And we put our data into a statistical program, and we could see that our overall confidence, this is just that last question, the rating on a 5-point scale was 1.7 on overall confidence, and at the end of the day it was 3.8. So the mean difference, which is the effect size on that 5-point scale, was 2.1 points. Which is a pretty large on a 5-point scale difference, basically. And you can go over and see that our p-value was statistically significant, so we're happy about that. And then we, of course, computed our Cohen's d using the formula that you've probably seen before, where you plug the t-value in here and divide it by the square root of the number of cases. You can see there are 10 people here, and we put it there. And if you do that computation, you get a 1.38. And what you know is that 0.2, 0.5, 0.8, and 1.0 are threshold values for Cohen's d from small to very large. And so you can see that this would be, you know, a practically significant difference. We would be happy with this. We'd also be we'd be interested to see how those effect sizes varied over topics. It might be that some of the topics would be less, would have smaller effect sizes, which could, if you really think about it, could trigger some interest in maybe looking at the content for those, the presentation for those. I hope I'm making sense here. I'm going to show you an example of a student who did this in a little bit, so it'll make sense. So anyway, that's, you know, that's really kind of the heart of the design. Essentially, it's really a pre-post design, but you only measure once, and you actually have people do a retrospective rating. That's just how straightforward it is. You could also, if you wanted to track change, and I think I mentioned this, I made these data up. So all the upward sloping lines were the moms who made gains, and then we had a couple of moms who basically didn't change this. The horizontal line were moms that, you know, had a 3 at the beginning and had a 3 at the end. So I think I just, you know, discussed this, so we're happy with that. So a couple comments about, and this is in the material that I shared with you, so you can read up on these things. So these are some, you know, some problems, they call them threats to internal validity, some problems with the design that you really do need to keep in mind. First of all, recall can be a problem depending on, you know, your population. There might be some people who really have trouble, especially if it's just a day thing, you're probably not going to have recall problems. But if you do this, and you could do this for a 6-week or an 8-week intervention of some sort or another, you know, there may be problems with people actually literally thinking back to where they started. I don't know that it's a crippling issue, but it's something to pay attention to. We talked about social desirability bias, and you can read that. Effort justification bias is sort of interesting. People have determined that sometimes respondents rate better ratings just because they spent the time and effort in, you know, attending. I don't have a good example of that, but it could be something to pay attention to, of course. And then cognitive dissonance may have to do with the fact that people actually expect that they should have changed and maybe would rate that, which I think is sort of fascinating. Anyway, these are things to keep in mind. We did have the conversation, about how to control for these some of these things, and not so much in the retrospective, post, and pre, but I did a lot of survey work with students at various grade levels, actually, and students can be notoriously difficult when it comes to honesty and sort of forthrightness, and especially with some of the things that we were asking them, questions that we were asking them. So I always say to people, don't just hand out a survey and ask people to fill it out. I think having a conversation about the purpose of the survey or the measurement tool, whatever it might be, and you would do this on a single case or a group design, absolutely. What it's about, what it's measuring, talk about the possibility that you don't have to answer every question. Anonymity is important, it can be so, but just being honest about what the instrument is designed to do, and honest about the need for honesty, if that makes sense. So really asking people, and I think we were able, and I might be deluding myself, but I think mainly we were able to get people to be more honest. So definitely, at least you've addressed the issue. I mean, if you just hand something to somebody and expect they're going to understand it, it's a very naive way to collect data, essentially. So hopefully I'm making sense here, that you will actually have some protocol, some pattern, some script that you read, and in a natural way, so you get people to rate a little more honestly. So this is just a real quick comparison of the regular pre-post and then retrospective. You can kind of go through this to see some of the advantages. You can see there are some advantages down here. It just sort of lists this, and you can kind of look that over, and it is a part of some of the material we shared with you. So this is I had a student in a certificate program who was working with caregivers and had aging parents, and she was concerned about caregiving, self-efficacy, burnout, those sorts of things. And so she found this. She was doing the program was called Powerful Tools for Caregivers Education. You can see it's part of the Extension Service. Extension Service actually has done a lot with retrospective, post, and pre. Some of the material I shared with you is actually from the Wisconsin Extension Service. So Extension Services have been interested in this. So you can kind of see how this is laid out in a practical way for her. Before, on a 4-point scale, feel confident in asking for help, understand emotions, find ways to take care of my own health. You can go down the list of things. And these are all components of the Powerful Tools for Caregivers that got addressed in one form or another in the content. And then, we had the after rating. And she had data for about 40 participants, basically, and she found it was quite a helpful tool where content was rated well from pre to post for some areas and not so well for other areas, and she used that information in a kind of a program improvement sense, which was really cool. She did a great job. I was very happy with that. And this is a student that I had last year, maybe the year before, actually, who did a capstone. You can see a project, a capstone project, basically. I don't know. I don't think she cares if I tell who it is. Her name's Jordan Allen. I don't know if she's still in town. I've kind of lost track with her, but she was a great student and did a great job. So You can see the title of her presentation, and you'll be doing a presentation like this. It's actually the PowerPoint version of the capstone project that you'll be doing. So it's called Empowering Young Women Through Healthy Communication and Relationships. So real quickly, she was at Whitehall Yearling. She had some 10th grade girls that were, involved with negative messaging, unhealthy relationships, and unhealthy communication, or at least were vulnerable to that. I don't think these girls were necessarily had all these things going on, but certainly vulnerable to that. And so her goal was to, sort of provide some skills around dealing with those sorts of things. It's really actually very cool. This really isn't an answerable question. It really is more, it's sort of, I guess, is, but she had high school girls who lacked knowledge of healthy communication and relationships that she was working with in a group. And this is the name of the program. Actually, it's called Ruling Our Experiences. And it focused on understanding and practicing and recognizing some of the key concepts that were a part of the content. So she had an ecological theory of change. So this is really an abbreviated version. Your PowerPoints are going to be like summary versions. So she actually did a very nice. She actually won a prize at the end of the year. I have to nominate a couple of students, one student from each section, and there's a poster session presentation. It's a little bit of a competition of sorts there's a breakfast for field instructors, basically. I think it's in April, right before graduation. And so she was a winner. She did a really super nice job. So Ruling Our Experiences, I don't know that it was necessarily evidence-based, probably more evidence-informed, but in some ways, I think she needed to do this. I think her field supervisor was interested in this. But it's okay. I mean, we can use evidence-based practices programs, sometimes, but we don't always have to, especially if we're going to, do an evaluation. So you can kind of go through and see the content for that. She had a little more detail in, I'm not going to go through this in her paper. So she did a retrospective post and pre. She had, I'm not sure what applicable terms would be. She had 3 sections: understanding, practicing, recognizing. The reliability issue was not, psychometric issue wasn't, she wasn't able to address it because she actually made this up. So there wasn't any psychometric information to share. And then she did the sort of feasibility of doing this and felt that the way she formatted it was feasible. I think she ended up making some suggestions about kind of improvements if she did it in the future that would be helpful. So sorry about the I printed this out as a PDF, and actually this is a PowerPoint. I don't know. It doesn't matter. It's understanding. So this was her retrospective post and pre. 5-point passive communication, aggressive communication, empathy, victim blame, coercion. You can go down the list of things here. So, and she flipped it. She had people rated after and then rate before. It doesn't really matter. I've seen it done a couple of different ways, so it's not a big deal. And this is practice, assertive communication and empathy. You can see that. And then finally, recognizing victim blaming, passive communication, coercion, this sort of similar content areas that we saw in understanding and recognizing. So pretty cool. It was actually, it's an interesting, the content is interesting. Some of you who are working with empowerment of especially young ladies might be interested in it. validity, differences, and absences. She had some. These are some of the challenges, and she had difficulties in some of the implementation stuff. I don't remember all the details. This is part of what you're going to have to do, but mainly what I'm most interested in sharing with you is this. So this was her statistical information. So she ended up with all 6, and they rated. So you can see understanding, passive communication, assertive communication, all had pretty good size gains. They went from low means to high means along the way, basically. And she did Cohen's D, and she came up with very large effect sizes, which is, which can happen. Basically, you can see this is an enormous jump. Basically, some of these were really quite high. So you can have a Cohen's D of 3 points. Not usually typical, but you can have those. So she had pretty good Cohen's D's. You can see that understanding coercion, physical abuse, emotional abuse, and sexual abuse was a little bit, in terms of magnitude, was a little more modest. These are not bad effect sizes, but her, as I recall, her sort of program improvement comments were maybe doing more about understanding physical, emotional, and sexual abuse, basically, which can be very important. Although another part of the issue was people started pretty high in the rating, which also sort of accounts for some of this stuff. So interesting. She got some information back anyway. I hope that made sense and was helpful for her. So in terms of practice in her sort of communication and empathy, I'm not really sure that I know exactly what she was meaning on this, but so they started off pretty high on the scale, at least on the sort of communication, and about midpoint on empathy, but still had nice gains basically on that 5-point scale. She was happy with that. And then recognizing victim blaming, you can see again. There are some differences here with maybe some higher ratings, essentially. As I recall, she did talk a little bit about some issues, even with retrospective post and pre-ratings of social desirability things. I think she was somewhat concerned about these higher ratings, and they did this stuff at the end. So these ratings would be after they've been exposed to this. So, but she was happy with this. These are good effect sizes, and we gave her some information, and she plugged it back into the program improvement process, basically. So. A couple of things that she said might have been an issue. They didn't read through the test together. I wasn't sure why she didn't do that. We sort of talked about it, but apparently she just gave them a survey and said fill it out. So can't remember quite what she said about giving the test at the end of the session. I'm not sure if there was a timing thing, and then something about lunch. And I should know more about it. I actually don't remember the presentation. What I was mainly happy, me, you guys by now know me, I was mainly happy about the fact she had some interesting data with some interesting effect sizes, and she was able to do something with that and have it make sense. But she did reflect a little bit on the overall experience, which is really pretty cool. So, and then she put in her references. That's good. So that's really it. And you might be a little underwhelmed with this until you start thinking about how it might be helpful for you if you're doing small group or even large group presentations. There's really no group limit on this. If you're dealing with 30 or 40 students or people or participants of whatever nature, you could actually use this and use it effectively. So I would encourage you to go read the material if you're interested. You can always call me or email me if you have questions, about how to use it. I'm a big fan, as I said. If it seems to fit into your project, I would say go for it. I've had a lot of students actually use this and use it effectively in some ways. And it definitely minimizes, one of the big issues that it minimizes is the fact that you sometimes just through attrition or change or just circumstances end up with, pre's and posts that aren't matched, and it's absolutely essential that you have matched pre's and posts. So if you only do it once, you're ensuring that you'll have matched responses, basically, unless people don't answer a question. So anyway, stay in touch. I hope this was helpful. I'll get it posted and give me some feedback if you have a chance.